It is demonstrably true that higher education is the most reliable means of transitioning into a sustaining career for oneself and one's family. That people who have attended some post-secondary education, they earn more, they have better health outcomes, they are more actively participating in civil society, voting, et cetera. All sorts of indicators of a healthy and productive and contributing and participatory life correlate with having attended higher education.
You're listening to Pacific Time, a podcast about the bold experiments, messy contradictions, and unexpected possibilities of life on the West Coast. I'm your host, Greg Ammerfell. Higher education has been in the federal crosshairs. Ivy League institutions on the East Coast have borne the brunt of the attack, but the withdrawal of federal research funding, attacks on free speech, and the unsettling treatment of international students has academics across the U.S. up in arms, cowering for shelter, and seeking strength in numbers. Our system of higher education can rightly claim to be an American crown jewel, and there's ample evidence of this on the West Coast. Our major research universities are the engine of our innovation economy, producing scientific breakthroughs and critical thinkers for our workforce. Our West Coast state universities and community colleges propel upward mobility and accessible skill building in good times and bad. Beyond its contributions, higher ed is also one of our country's biggest battlegrounds, has been for a long time. For decades, college promised a ticket to upward mobility. But what happens when tuition soars, state residents struggle to get into their state universities, trust craters, and nearly half of students don't graduate? What happens when the cost structure and the very model for training falls out of step with what the country needs? Our guest is Dan Greenstein. He's run Pennsylvania's state university system, and before that, he was hard at work on the West Coast. He led higher ed reforms at the Gates Foundation in Seattle, where, in full disclosure, I consulted to his team. And prior to joining Gates, Dan was part of the University of California system and a pioneer in online learning. He knows this landscape inside and out. In this episode, Dan gives us the big picture history of how higher ed rose and what caused it to stumble. Then we talk about the road ahead. Could the West Coast create a new model that's more affordable, inclusive, and career-ready? One that centers AI as the tutor every one of us could have used? Here's where I began.
So if you go back even to the post-Second World War, you saw this tremendous growth, just really this complete swelling in the ranks in terms of enrollments in higher education, partly due to the fact that there was funding for GIs to go back to college, to reintegrate into society, followed not too far after by Pell Grants, so that the idea was that we needed a more educated workforce, which was true, and that more and more new jobs after the war and right through the next 50 years required more, not less, more, not fewer people with some post-secondary education after high school, basically. And so you saw this incredible investment of state and federal governments in expanding the ranks of more educated citizenry as necessary by, a workforce, which was transitioning from an industrial to a knowledge economy. I mean, that's what's been going on now. We're, of course, in a post-knowledge economy. So you think about the long arc. And then, you see, from the 50s, 60s, you see women entering the workforce in much larger numbers, sort of dual income households. And so you see much more growth in terms of, both men and women. And then increasingly after the civil rights era, Black and brown students, entering in greater numbers into higher education. And there was this enormous swelling, right? Because it was a baby boom generation, right? They called that tidal wave 1, crashing down on, schools, higher education. And then you had tidal wave 2, which were the children of the baby boomers. And so there was this tremendous period of growth, which was sort of driven by economic necessity, driven by population growth, driven by federal and state funding. And things begin to slow down, right? And, you saw state investment begin to slow really in the 90s, early 2000s in terms of per capita investment in students attending higher education.
So that's the long arc. But what about the reputation of higher ed? When did public trust start to crack?
Well, so it's taken a hit, and so what's happening with the administration is really building on real increasing skepticism from the general public. And you see a number of trends, right? And they're all related to the kind of thing. So, on the one hand, things are getting out of hand in terms of cost, right? The cost of a college education is just, increasing. Net price of attendance is growing, in leaps and bounds. And at the same time, what's called the college wage premium, people who attend college tend to earn more over the course of a lifetime than people who finish their education in high school. That wage premium had sort of capped out at 100%. That's beginning to decline as well. And you're beginning to see real skepticism, A, in the cost of a higher education, and B, in the return on its investment. So there's this real question about the value of higher education. And it shows up in the data, right? 25% of higher ed programs don't actually get you that wage premium, right? I think the statistics show 40-ish%, maybe closer to half of all college graduates are working in a job that doesn't actually require their degree. So you're seeing some evidence that, there's this kernel. So there's real question about the value of higher education. And then it's being layered with this question about our values, right? So, sorry, let me go back to value. The graduation rate seems something like 40% of students who start in a post-secondary college or university don't finish there, right? So you have $1.7 trillion of outstanding student loan debt, right, to something like 40 million students. So you've got a lot of people for whom higher education has not worked, has not fulfilled that promise of social mobility, of a better job, of a sustaining career. So there's this real skepticism about its value, and it's showing up in polling since about 2012, Gallup polling. Really, it used to be sort of partisan, Republican, much more than Democrats questioning the value of higher education. It's become bipartisan.
Let's go deeper. It's not just about financial value, it's about values. What is higher ed even for in this moment?
But then layer on top of that, you have these questions increasingly of values. And that kind of reflects the sort of partisan divide, in higher education increasingly getting swept up into the maw of sort of American political discourse. This question of values, has a number of sort of facets to it. And again, there's with questions of value, there are kernels of truth at their core. So if you look at, I just posted something on LinkedIn over the weekend. I quoted some statistics. Survey after survey of institutions, there's, where you ask, staff and faculty and students to sort of self-identify their political orientation, show a profound tilt to the left. I mean, it's not just, it's not a reflection of the country, which is largely almost evenly divided, right, over the last several presidential election cycles. So you see this really significant part of this country, which feels left behind, right? And they have been very vocal in 2016 and again in 2024, and they were very vocal in 2020, but, missed a presidential election by not very much. And those voices are real, and they're pissed off. Whether they have reason to be pissed off or not, that's not the question. This is a democracy, and people are able to vote. Good thing, independently of what they think. And so, I think there's some listening, frankly, that higher education has to do about its value, and about its values. And so, what you're seeing in the administration, I want to be very clear about this. I mean, there's a very rich and growing literature about, the fact that it's an overreach of executive authority and that it's not policy, it's punitive and all the rest of it. And there's a lot of legitimacy. But at the same time, higher education has been somehow complicit in creating an atmosphere where it is a very difficult target to defend, because we begin to add up the people who've been underserved because they've been in higher education and they've stopped out and they have debt and no degree, and they've faced some of the challenges, or they're in a job that doesn't really require or return an investment. Or they're looking at a higher education, family looking at attending higher education, trying to figure out how to pay for it. Or they're people who have watched on television as faculty and students, frankly, at very privileged places, where they're hating on America in some pretty aggressive and, free speech is great. And obviously, one supports the First Amendment 100%. I'd be the first to die on that hill. But, at the same time, the visual imagery is not good. And there's a difference between free speech and trespass and violation of property and whatever. So it's not adding to a lot of trust and good feeling. And somehow we're going to have to I think the higher education, the community, the industry is going to have to rebuild the public trust that it has lost. But until we win ourselves back into the public trust, this is a long and difficult journey, in my view. And it's, higher education is not one place, and you know that, right? And how do we address these concerns in real and practical ways? And, as I've been writing and speaking over the last several months, and as much appalled by what's happening to the industry, which I love and have devoted my life to, at the same time, I keep thinking, maybe a little humility. We recognize that we have these problems. It's not that we don't know that 40% of the students who start an institution stop out, right? It's not that we don't know that there are $1.7 trillion worth of debt and the students who have stopped out and had no degree and have that debt, that isn't of itself a problem. And few of us can put our hands on our hearts and say, yeah, we've done everything we can to address those issues. We haven't.
Before we talk about how to fight back or reform the system, I asked Dan to pause and assess what higher ed is still getting right. Much of the media focuses on elite universities, but Dan reminds us that most students attend regional, non-selective colleges, places that don't make headlines, but make a huge difference.
Sure, it is demonstrably true that higher education is the most reliable means of transitioning into a sustaining career for oneself and one's family. That people who have attended some post-secondary education, they earn more, they have better health outcomes, they are more actively participating in civic, civil society, voting, etc. All sorts of indicators of a healthy and productive and contributing and participatory life correlate with having attended, higher education. So that's a great thing. You could argue that higher education, when I was a chancellor of the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education, 14 universities when I started there, 10 now, which are less selective. I mean, like 90% of the people who apply get in. And, I would say, and I believe it, our universities don't just change lives, they save some. And when you lift up an individual, you're not just lifting up that individual, this. You're lifting up their family. You're actually lifting up their community. So, higher ed, there's all sorts of economic impacts. It's communities in a place where there's a thriving college or university are doing very well. Like they tend to be a leading employer. There's a lot of positive economic impacts, but over and above that, they are lifting up whole communities. And then if you look at some of our, so many communities across the country, especially in rural areas now, they rely on their universities and colleges, not just for jobs, but for the next generation of, businessman and woman and teacher and healthcare worker and, civic leader. And it's harder to recruit people sometimes into rural. So you kind of grow your own. And so those institutions are significantly important, not just because of the economic impacts today, not just because they're providing a pathway for mobility for people today, but because they're also kind of shoring up the future of these communities tomorrow by ensuring that they have the people that they need to stay vibrant.
We'll be right back. This episode of Pacific Time is brought to you by Share It Music, the label that believes in music with a mission. Based right here on the West Coast, Share It is home to artists who push boundaries, blur genres, and send messages. One of our new favorites, San Gabriel, whose latest track, Running Out of Time, is the kind of propulsive dream pop that harkens back to the 80s in the best way. Crafted by the multi-talented James Bookert, the song emerged as he faced a health scare and career crossroads, working nights and weekends at a liquor store in East Austin. Shout out to indie artists in Austin, Texas. Running Out of Time is an all-occasion anthem for facing decisions like, how can I best stand up for democracy? Plus, you can play the whole track at the very end of this episode and stand up for democracy while you dance in your kitchen. Stream San Gabriel wherever you listen and learn more about the purposefully nonprofit Share It Music at shareitmusic.org. Independent music and podcasts about independence goes together, doesn't it? Now, back to the show.
One thing I want to go back and define is you made reference to the post-knowledge economy. On the way to describing the kind of higher ed system the country needs that will be more responsive to the value people need it to deliver, could you define the post-knowledge economy?
Yeah, it's probably a random phrase that maybe I'm going to regret now having used. So, I think we're moving into a world where knowledge workers are going to be increasingly found themselves displaced by artificial intelligence. I think the group that's most, bizarrely, in some ways, the professional knowledge workers are more at risk, I think, in terms of job loss from AI than others. And I'm not, prognosticating a catastrophic future as a consequence of artificial intelligence. That's not the point. But I think we're moving into a world where we're going to have to think differently about how we deploy, knowledge workers whose work can be accomplished very productively with the assistance of artificial intelligence. And, Paul LeBlanc has written passionately about this topic, and he thinks about, imagine what you could do if, I'll speak of it in terms of education, if education becomes less about knowledge delivery and learning and more about the scaffolding that you put around people to lift them up and make them feel comfortable with themselves and the knowledge that they're engaging in the lives that they have. Imagine if you could redeploy your professoriate more in that direction and less in terms of knowledge training. And I'm not suggesting we do this. I don't want anyone to freak out as I say this. However, we know that data show, you're going to forgive the language, it's a little crass, but, in terms of helping people get into and through higher education, wrapping your arms around them with supports is really important. And it's really interesting. So, if you look forward at the workforce demand, we have this really weird situation where you've got a declining number of people participating in university, in post-secondary education. And yet, if you look forward, you have more, not fewer jobs, a higher proportion, not a lower portion of jobs requiring people with some post-secondary education. So we have to get more people into and through. You think about that, getting more people into and through some form of post-secondary education. I don't necessarily mean a BA degree or an MA degree or even an associate's degree. We could be talking about short course certifications, whether it's in emergency medicine or in or EMT, or in some sort of security, or even in some, computational activities. Tons of short course certifications that are required in the workforce that enable people to, skill up into jobs and continue to grow in those skills. Now you pull on that thread and you realize that higher education, higher or not, education is not a water hose. Turn it to the next person, they get as wet as the last, right? So teaching the first generation college student who comes to an institution and is first in her family to attend college. She's been a great high school student, but she doesn't have the family resources to draw on to help her navigate our crazy town, right? That's a very different animal than teaching the guy who's 55, lost his job pulling line in a utility company and needs now to somehow reskill. I don't care about your 4-year residential BA forget about it. I need to get some sort of certification that I can get a job to stay myself and my family. Right. So they're two completely different kinds of education. We're different yet again than, a student who's 4th generation college goer who's come from, exceptionally supported family environment, has been a very good student, et cetera. They're all different. Right. So the knowledge delivery, super important, is less important in some ways than being able to ensure that those people have the kind of personalized attention that they need to succeed. To the best of their ability. And, I think one of the challenges that higher education has faced as it's grown is how does it personalize the educational delivery and the student support so that it can reach every student and ensure that every student can and should succeed. And so the excitement about moving forward is, gosh, if you can dial back on some of the time and effort in the kind of knowledge transmission and sort of reallocate some of that effort into the sort of student support, wow, could we do a lot more? Getting more, remember, the problem set is getting more people who have not been served, so, by higher education, who may come from communities who do not have a college-going culture, whatever. How do you get more people into and through so we can keep the lights on? I think that this potential, so in this post-knowledge economy, we're able to think differently about how we allocate the human resources that we're using.
Yeah. So I mean, my interpretation of the way you define a post-knowledge economy is that it's not a post-skill economy. I think what you're saying is we're going to have to learn skills and then learn new skills. And so higher ed's core function is going to have to be helping people learn how to learn over and over and over again, and then providing vehicles that look really different than our movie version of a 4-year college education where people go and drink at fraternities and sororities and muddle through with a bachelor's degree. It's more, I think in my time working with your crew at the Gates Foundation, I remember the average age of college goers went over 26 years old. That's not, an 18-year-old graduating high school and going to get a degree on an Ivy-covered campus. That's something different.
100%.
Can higher ed reinvent itself for a skeptical public, especially when budgets are shrinking?
Oh, yeah. Because I've seen it done. Look, you did too. When COVID in Pennsylvania, I'm sitting in my office. My team is, we're kind of a leadership team on the same floor, and we're always in and out of each other's offices and doing whatever. And we get this phone call from the governor's office, which says basically the governor's going to shut down all of education in about 20 minutes. It's like, thanks a lot, right? And so everybody, of course, convenes in our conference room. We're like, oh my God. And the only good news was it was, I think, on a Friday. I think it was the 13th of March. And it was, for most of our schools, some of them had a little bit of a different spring break schedule, but for most of our schools, they were just about to enter into spring break. They had a week. We completely re-engineered, maybe not in a week, but we re-engineered the entire higher education, turns out, is designed to transmit airborne disease. Who knew, right? If you think about it, it has residence halls, it has dining facilities, it has classrooms. It has sports facilities, it has gyms, right? It is all about, if you had to design an organization to transmit airborne disease, you would design a residential college and university, right? And so we recognized, with whatever information was available to us, and we redesigned the entire operation. And we kept going. What was so amazing, and people lose touch with this, was the business continuity. Not just from the middle of March, the middle of one term, to the fall, the start of the fall term. No, we kept going that term, right? I'm not saying it was great. It was clunky. It had, very different impacts on faculty, staff, and students, of course, and their families. But we managed to keep going. And actually, if you look at the numbers, it's fascinating. There's a little bit of a tailing off in things, graduation, retention rates, some tailing off in enrollments for a couple of years, but it was on the margins, Greg. Places that were tanking anyway in enrollment in those areas would continue to tank. It didn't help, obviously, but on balance, it's amazing what we pulled off in no time. So I don't want to hear we can't do this stuff. And I can point to any number of existence proofs, right? So let's start with affordability. Is the only thing we can do about affordability is just rely on federal and state government support. We froze tuition for 7 years at Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education. And for 3 of those years, we had no meaningful increase in state support. How did we do that? We re-engineered our business model. We took $350 million of cost out of our operations and invested it back in our students. In Southern New Hampshire, Western Governors, Purdue, places which have had long periods of tuition freezes, have not benefited from federal and state. So when someone says, no, there's no more we can do, I don't believe it. I don't. And now we're in a battle, and it is a battle for the soul of this industry, which will rest, which will live, will flourish or not, on the extent to which it is able to recapture the public faith. It is not the time to say, oh no, we can't change anything, any of our operational or educational functions in order to return benefit directly to students in terms of affordability. I have been active in philanthropy and as a higher education administrator in efforts which have demonstrably and significantly changed student success rates and eliminated gaps that exist between rural and urban and wealthy and less wealthy and black and brown on the one hand and white students on the other, and have meaningfully addressed those gaps through deliberate and disciplined attention to the adoption of evidence-based strategies that are known to work. It's really hard because people have to change what they do, whether you're trying to address affordability or you're trying to address student outcomes. There's too much it's too much of an existence proof that we can do this shit, right? So why would it? It's so interesting. I was saying this in 2016, 2017, because the evidence base under student success-oriented efforts, is pretty big. It's growing. It's like, it's not any longer a matter of what to do. It's like, why are we doing it? It's like, I remember a conversation. This is back in I left the Gates Foundation in 2018. So this must have been 2016, 2017. And we're with this guy from the University of Washington who's a lecturer there. I think his name was Freeman. And he did some very impressive research and some meta-studies as well on what's called active teaching and the advantages of active teaching, where you're engaging the student as opposed to just lecturing. And there's feedback loops and there's, capstone, a bunch of what we call them high-impact practice, really to engage the students in their own learning as opposed to having it be a very passive receipt. And the evidence about the effectiveness of active learning is overwhelming, right? And it comes out of, things like RC2, really overwhelming, strong evidence. And I remember one of my colleagues at the foundation, said, if there was a doctor in a hospital and the doctors in that hospital were not using interventions that had so much evidence of their success in treating patients, they would be sued for malpractice. We were all brought up during the growth years. So we were trained in all the wrong things. We knew how to add programs, right? But now we're talking about trade-offs, and that's really hard to do. And when you enjoyed 30 plus years and, but it's doable, Greg. And I think we're seeing two things. One of them is, God, I wish we'd done more. I wish we'd talked about it more effectively. And then I guess my second thought is, okay, no time like the present, we got a boogie.
Yeah. Well, and by the way, Dan, I'm hearing this across domains as I try to form some picture of what the West Coast could do if it started from scratch. Lesson one is follow the lesson of what works and has been proven to work, whether we're talking about wildfire or talking about national service or talking about higher education. The playbooks are out there. They don't necessarily need to be reinvented. It's only by comparison to a period of growth and plenty where we kind of lost the ability to just apply the playbooks and what's worked that this looks hard. And you're right. There's no discounting how hard making change is. So you at the Pennsylvania system made a lot of change across a very big institution. I'm curious to know about your lessons learned in that process. Some of those changes, I'm sure, were quite subtle. Some of them were well covered in the news. Contrast that to what we're watching in the Trump administration, which is not at all subtle, really taking a bulldozer to bureaucracy that in ways that I bet lots of leaders are taking notes on. What did you get right and wrong about making change in big systems? What is the Trump administration getting right and wrong?
Yeah, it's so funny. I mean, the jury is still out on both, I'm perfectly honest. I would like to think that it is possible to build a followership. So what the Trump administration is doing, I've seen others do, and you have too, it's move fast and be bold. It is in some ways maybe a reaction to another approach, which is to go slower and to build a followership. But, because you're in Seattle and I used to live there, at least when I was there was a sign on the wall outside the Gates Foundation, which was an African proverb, to go fast, go alone, to go far, go together, something like that. And I think that's true, and whether it's true or not, in my experience, and I've tried both modalities, I've never tried anything quite as dramatic as what the administration is doing, and I wouldn't want to, but you spend as much time cleaning up the mess, when you're moving fast and being that disruptive. There is a rebuilding period. When you're going more slowly and more deliberately to build a followership and to move people, and you're not going to do anything by consensus, but, I'm not actually convinced you get to the end state any slower. If because of the rebuild of the disruptive moment the disruptive approach can be so intense. So I'm not sure there's that's a hypothesis rather than an evidence-based statement.
Gosh, an analogy jumps to mind. I remember going back to driver's ed that, they'd portray the car that was driving 90 miles an hour, passing you on the highway, and then stopped at the stop sign. And you only got to the stop sign about a minute and a half after that car, so it didn't make that big a difference if you were driving super fast and breaking the law.
And there are ways to do that in higher education. And it requires leadership, which is able to change agency, change leadership is probably the hardest thing that as a leader that I've had to encounter and tried to do, because it does require that kind of, balancing act between, the speed at which you go and the extent to which if you can treat change agency kind of as a campaign, and if you think of a political campaign where you need 50% plus one, if you treat it as obviously you want more than that. You get a landslide, that's good too. But if you treat it as a campaign, you are going to end up with a followership. And you will build the change. I've written about this in my blog. This is a shameful trailer. Greenstein.com tells the Pesci story, right? But I think one of the preeminent lessons is that, that kind of change leadership is a campaign, and you need to think of, or at least I thought about it very much as a campaign, trying to get, the equivalent of the 50% plus one to get the change over the finish line. And you think ruthlessly about who you need to bring with you, and maybe who you need to neutralize because they're opposition, fortunately not many in my case, and how you can get to the biggest possible majority at the end of that period. And I think that's a good discipline because it sort of forces you to think about that after period where we're going to have to rebuild in this new world, in this new culture, where you need people who are going to sort of roll up their sleeves and dig in and change the nature of the work that they do and support the others who are doing that as well.
We're watching the Trump administration pick on Ivy League schools, in particular by withdrawing federal funding and their ability to enroll international students. The cases of those universities can represent, around a quarter of their student population. Even if the courts strike down those federal actions, has the damage been done not just to Harvard and Columbia, but to higher ed in general?
And again, it goes back to the sort of trust and faith and skepticism about our value and our values. I mean, I think what's happening, I fail to see the policy goals, be perfectly honest, in a lot of what's happening. It appears to me it can appear pretty punitive and almost, vindictive. If there are policy goals, they're opaque. But I think it's, like I said, I think it's possible because there's not exactly the cheering squad for higher ed. There's a bunch of higher ed insiders, I'm beginning to see a few things in the Wall Street Journal and maybe some other, but not much. I think it is a reflection of the amount of ground we need to cover. So is the damage been done, or is it just an articulation of damage that's been accumulating over time? And is this a reckoning that we're going to have to face? I mean, we're going to have to probably have to reinvent ourselves. I mean, it is, strategy. I've never been keen on the strategy of hope, although, one could hope, just in, the next presidential election cycle, things will swing back. I don't see that happening. What do you need to believe that's going to happen? Some of that stuff is a big stretch. So I think we're going to, the sooner we begin to live into a new reality and figure out how to not only do what we do, but be better at it and to be more productive and reliable in the eyes of our public, I think is going to be important.
Yeah, I've wondered if this period, in a lot of ways, but particularly with higher ed, represents for university leaders a chance to sort of be in judo mode. How do they absorb the energy of all this change to make change that they ought to be considering anyway? So Dan, what are your ideas for how to make positive change and to make the most of what is obviously a very tumultuous time?
We have to get our arms around student outcomes. We just have to. There is no excuse any longer for, life will get in the way for our students. They will stop out. Shit happens. It's too bad. And it's sometimes tragic. There's nothing stopping us from integrating into our curriculum, our degree-bearing curriculum, the course sequences that lead to an AA or a BA degree. There's nothing stopping us from integrating into those courses and course sequences credentials that have value in the marketplace, so that if I stop out after my first term even, I still have something to show for my tuition dollar. So we can change our degree programming so that people are able to acquire credentials of value even if they do stop out. And we can be more transparent about things like pricing. This has been in the news. It's very difficult to know how much it's going to cost. We can be very transparent about, opportunity to achieve certain outcomes. So I think if you think about college going today, undergraduates, BAs alone, the average student attends 1.7 to 2.1 institutions in the pursuit of their BA degree. That number would be a much higher if you included graduate students because they move around all the time. And it's going to get bigger and not smaller because people are going to begin to sort of accumulate credentials across a lifetime, right? And yet, credit mobility, the ability to transfer a credit that I earned over here to an institution over there, is really frictionful. There's no excuse for it. The biggest criticism I hear is, well, that school that they took that course in is not as good as us. It's like, are you kidding me?
What I'm hearing you hint at is the need for more collaboration, both related to credentials, but also to credit across schools. I've also heard you talk, Dan, about the research enterprise and how the current funding environment may speak to the need for universities to basically join forces in the way they provide for research.
I think, so I think there's a couple of things. So I think on the one hand, I do think that imagine designing your degree pathways, your credentialing pathways with a view not of having the student here in our box and we see between the walls of our institution, but actually with a view of credentialing pathways generally. So I am now wide open. In fact, I can imagine funding regimes where schools are rewarded for the credentials that they accept and for the students that they produce that go on to transfer elsewhere. I mean, I can see ways to but in a collaborative environment, shared services have shown to be very productive in back office, payroll, HR, facilities management, illegal, whatever, where people share the cost of services that they all require, but maybe can't afford on their own as well, right? That's moving into the front office. We're seeing a lot more work. There's a publication coming out from Nash soon about shared programming, shared courses. Think of a small school with, 2,000 students or less. Maybe it can support 30, 40 majors. With sharing programs, they can support, the students can have access to 100 majors. We were doing that at Pennsylvania State System. So all of our schools students could have access to way more majors and minors than their institution could afford based on their enrollments. We're seeing shared courses. Now it's going to be interesting, as we move into the future, if we're seeing significant reductions in the overhead rate paid for research funding, as well as reduction in the available research funding, it's not beyond the bounds of reason that you're going to see research facility, technology, equipment, techs, people, supporting staff becoming a shared, you can think of research facility and research capability as a shared service. So there's, you're seeing sort of the collaborative, which is all about amortizing costs and delivering higher degree of performance, moving from the back office where nobody knew about it, just took out costs, into the front office where it creates opportunity.
Yeah, I've seen examples of what you're talking about in K-12, a high school in Grand Rapids, Michigan that offered Chinese and Arabic classes to the handful of kids who wanted them, not because they could pay for a teacher to teach that handful of kids. They just brought it in online. I've seen, private schools offer their courses in medical examining, which is endlessly interesting to kids, and disseminate those across whole networks. While we're on the subject of collaboration, Dan, and this being a show about what if the West Coast could imagine itself from scratch? What if California, Oregon, and Washington designed a system of higher ed from scratch? What would that look like? Noting your experience at the Gates Foundation, noting your experience at the University of California.
So, they did this once at the Western Governors University, where, funnily enough, named after the Western governors who got together and stood it up, right? Which was a very different approach to education. It was a way to open up education mostly to, non-traditional adult learners, students who had some college and no degree. It was a competency-based approach. So you're learning, you're progressing towards your degree on the competencies that you master, not the number of hours you sit and see. So very different. Western Governors has grown to be one of the largest institutions of higher education in the country, and one of the largest ever. I mean, it's probably got pushing 200,000 concurrent enrollments. It's been tremendously successful. Operating nationally, out of it. So is it time to do that again? Maybe it's time to do it again. What does that look like? I think one would need to be, pretty focused in the way that Western Governors was. What's the problem we're trying to solve? One of the challenges that universities face in particular is that they're operating across multiple product lines or business models, right? They're research organizations, they're teaching organizations, they have adult and continuing education, they do all sorts of other things, right?
They host football teams.
Correct. They football health centers, right? So that there's lots of different business models which interact in a very often opaque and poorly understood way, and can have upside, obviously, can also have tremendous, negative leverage is a big deal. And when it happens, it, right? So I think there's an opportunity to focus on a particular set of, on a single problem. Maybe it's the skill, maybe it's getting more people into high demand occupations. Maybe it's in ensuring greater access to the kind of general education that is critical to ensuring, people have communication, learn how to learn, right? So for a lifetime. But I think focusing down on the problem and then sort of starting from a whiteboard. If we had to build it today, what would it look like? I guarantee if we had to build it today and it were optimizing around access, outcomes, and affordability. And now I'm thinking about instruction in learning that enables people to sort of get a lift in their lives. And you were designed around access, affordability, and outcomes. It would not look like it does today. What would it look like? It would be interesting to take N number of Western governors. You determine which N. And I know that one of them, I know Gavin Newsom had that workforce development report for California. So there's some data there. So supplement it with the data from the other states and say, what are our workforce needs in 20 years? What kind of person do we need and how many more of them? And then do the math. Where are we going to get them? I promise you there are not enough. It will be a math problem that there will not be enough. I'm going to call them, say, college ready people at any age group to fill that pipeline. And so we're going to have to think very differently about how we recruit and engage and successfully educate. What if I've been in conversations with, as you have, around artificial intelligence, and I love it. It cracks me up every time. People are like always, oh my God, what's AI going to do to us? It's like, people, we're leaders in higher education. Rather than thinking about what's AI going to do, going to do to my university, shouldn't we be saying about what would it mean to build my university around artificial intelligence? Just because it's intellectually interesting, but also because maybe there's some goodness in the exercise. And again, it's not all about, giving over. That's not the point. The point is that we have to sort of level up our game. And it isn't always clear to me that the best way to do that is to operate entirely within the constructs that we feel comfortable with. So starting new, boy, if you could figure it out, and if you could figure it out in a domain that would not immediately elicit the blowback of the interested parties, the institutions that continue and want to continue to thrive in their current modality, in the way that actually Western Governors University did. Western Governors was not supplantive. It was not designed to supplant existing effort. It was designed to supplement. So what would today's engineering project look like?
What are the other what if questions you'd ask people in Western states about higher ed?
Gosh, that is a great question.
I'll build on that to say, what if Western states built a financial aid system independent of the federal government that recognized student outcomes and rewarded affordability?
And what if the entity that was providing the education was operated in a way that it fundamentally changed the dimensions of the affordability? What if the objective was to get the net price of attendance to near zero for families earning under X? And then, really dramatically change the bar.
That was Dan Greenstein, who spent his career fighting for a better higher education system and who still believes it can lift families, communities, and the country. A few takeaways. 1, this crisis didn't begin with student protests. It started with disinvestment, demographic shifts, and a tuition model that no longer works. 2, the best defense isn't defensiveness. It's listening and then changing. So I have a whole bunch of spicy questions and some ideas. First, is the Trump administration's attack on higher ed all bad? What if these vitally important institutions absorb the blows and use the energy to streamline and modernize themselves? What changes will they make to be regarded as American crown jewels in 50 or 100 years? Second, let's talk about DEI, 3 letters with a bad reputation they don't deserve. What if universities redoubled their commitment to the indisputably healthy words underneath the acronym? Say them with me. Diversity, equity, inclusion. It's how these words are applied that need continuous work. University communities, including administrators, faculty, students, and alumni, need to find civil ways to make room for minority opinions and maintain clear rules for protest. It turns out that uncontested orthodoxies of any type warrant skepticism, and failing to protect an ongoing contest of ideas leaves the door open to authoritarianism. Watch what's happening all around us. Third, what if universities could further safeguard academic independence and scientific progress by moving past their gross reliance on U.S. federal funding? American higher ed has earned its global reputation, but maintaining its status means getting off its laurels. If the U.S. won't back the world's best research enterprises, something tells me that universities could form partnerships with governments and companies from outside the U.S.? Fourth, could the university lead a reinvigoration of higher ed's teaching mission that centers individual student needs, prepares them for the world ahead that will blend artificial and human intelligence, and earn back public trust for ROI that it proves over and over and over again, rather than with a concentrated dose of learning once in our formative years? If we on the West Coast can't invent an engaging form of continuous learning that blends the best of human and AI teachers, all packaged in a subscription like Netflix or Google Workspace, who can? That's enough spice for today. Thanks to Dan Greenstein for joining me, and thanks to you for being with me in Pacific Time. Please follow, share, and drop a review on your favorite podcast app, and come join the conversation at Pacific Time Podcast on Substack. And once again, I have a treat for staying to the very end of the episode. Here it is, Share It Music Act, San Gabriel, and the amazing track Running Out of Time. This music is a reminder that upbeat tunes that inspire urgency and dancing are exactly the kind of medicine we need to maintain our sanity and our emotional independence. Enjoy, and I'll see you soon.
It's different. But no, I can't keep up with the changes. Just try to make sense of the words that you're saying. Are we all running out of time? All running out of time. I'm taking my chances. Knife in the back, is this what romance is? I'm trying so hard to keep it together. Counting the days until